All right, everybody. Last lesson before spring break. Not a whole lot of stuff to go over. This one's actually going to be pretty short. So yeah, let's talk about actual conflict in the so-called Cold War and the reason why it matters. Okay, it's important to remember that a lot of books that you'll read, including at least one AP textbook, describe the Cold War as not violent. Well, that is true if you consider Western Europe to be the entirety of the world. However, it is not true that it was a peaceful time throughout the globe. And indeed, we're going to start in Asia, and we are going to look a little bit in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa as well today. But we're starting in Asia because there were three major land wars in Asia fought during the Cold War. Here's a bigger view of that map showing you kind of where we're going to be talking about today. I know the text is a little bit hard to read, but you don't need to worry too much about that. Okay, the first land war of the Cold War took place right after both the US and the Soviets had acquired nuclear weaponry, and also featured the Chinese in the only time that superpowers have had ground troops directly engaging one another officially since the end of the war, World War II, that is. The Korean War goes from 1950 to 1953. I know you can't see the dates past that third picture, but here's the thing. The opening phase of the Korean War honestly went like a windshield wiper up and down the Korean peninsula. North Korea stormed down and almost took the entirety of South Korea. The U.S. and UN forces, actually it's the first major military intervention of the United Nations, get together in a pocket in the south around the city of Busan and push all the way back up, almost all the way up into China, at which point the Chinese get involved and storm southward. And after that, things settle in, and the much more familiar border that is currently the border of North and South Korea is settled in on by 1953. The result is a military stalemate. North Korea becomes and remains a totalitarian communist state, or nominally communist state. What North Korea? North Korea is just North Korea, man. That's not an endorsement of communism or one of the annoying, well, real communism's never been tried statements. That's just one of those things that I don't know how you describe North Korea. But it settled in under the Kim family. South Korea, which actually had been the more backwards half of Korea. I know that's hard for us modern folks to wrap our brains around, but South Korea begins to modernize, industrialize, and become a member of the global community, manufacturer of lots of things, currently boy bands, but also, you know, cars and electronics and other such things. Vietnam had been a French colony. We've addressed this a little bit in previous lessons, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. At the end of the Second World War, after Japan had occupied it, it's eventually going to be split into communist and democratic halves after some fighting with the French. North Vietnam promotes an insurgency as well as outright invasion of South Vietnam. The U.S. follows its policy of containment to stop the spread of communism. North Vietnam is directly assisted by the Chinese. Some Soviet intervention, not as much as you would have seen in Mig Alley above the Korean peninsula, but eventually the communists, through a war of attrition that is horrific to fight both in as American soldiers and to have fought in your backyard for the Vietnamese. The Vietnam War leads to a lot of really, really awful violence, and it is won by the communists. In 1975, Vietnam is unified and becomes, again, a nominally communist nation today. Now, again, Vietnam produces stuff for American markets. Some of you probably have clothes that were made in Vietnam. They allow ownership of private property. They've basically abandoned the Marxist system of government controls everything, but they've kept the whole Communist Party is your only option to vote for mentality. And then there's the last one, the one that doesn't get nearly as talked about. When I was in school, really up to 9/11, it was almost talked about none at all, just as a mention near the end of the Cold War. Um, is the Soviet-Afghan War, which runs from 1979 to 1989. Afghanistan actually became communist in 1978, and as that government began to totter, the Soviets, who did border Afghanistan at the time, you'll have to look up a map, invade to help the communists out against much more conservative Muslim forces. The Soviets are, of course, directly involved. More than one source I've read calls this the Soviet Union's Vietnam. There are actually people who argue that this is what led to the fall of the Soviet Union, but people also say that about Chernobyl, so grain of salt. The U.S. sent money, weapons, etc. to the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters going against the Soviets. This collapses détente. This leads to back-to-back boycotts of first the Moscow Olympics in 1980 and then the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984. It is a real sloppy, nasty mess. It's a awful conflict. The Soviets withdraw from Afghanistan in 1989, at which point the Afghans begin fighting one another. And I am in the historical camp that considers the Afghan Civil War to have begun in 89 and to be continuing up and unto the present day. It is worthy to note that the last time Afghanistan had a functional government was more or less 1979. So in Latin America, which had long been under the auspices of the United States, the U.S. used the Monroe Doctrine and the Truman Doctrine to send money, weapons, occasionally trainers to assist in the anti-communist fighting in Latin America. The fighting is against communist rebels who are invariably supported by the Soviets in Cuba, and the U.S. is supporting anti-communists. Please notice, anti-communists, especially in Latin America, is not the same thing as democracy. A lot of U.S., and this is just one of those things, a lot of U.S. money and weaponry went to some really repugnant dictators in the 70s and 80s. The alternative was communist dictators, so whether or not you consider that to be better or worse, you're getting into choose your own history, alternate history, which, as you know, is not my side of the street. The results of this are predictable, though. Hundreds of thousands of people are displaced. Some of them still haven't gone home. Others are forced to live under rather brutal dictatorships. Of particular note is the overthrow in 1973 of Chile's Salvador Allende, who was a socialist, in favor of the backing of Augusto Pinochet, who was a military dictator who more than once liked to throw people out of helicopters, whom he accused of communism. But again, the big thing there is that Allende was elected. There's nothing more ironic to me that in the name of preserving democracy, a nation that marketed itself as the bulwark of democracy pretty much for a century before this had overthrown somebody who was democratically elected. Once again, that might provoke some stimulating emails, but the bottom line is that Pinochet, who was placed in charge of Chile after Salvador Allende, was not a pleasant person to be around. In sub-Saharan Africa, and this map actually does a really good job. I was really happy I found it. In sub-Saharan Africa, countries that were gaining their independence were forced to choose between democratic capitalism and communism, and that was, again, not as easy a choice as you would think looking back on it. We know now that which one of those systems keeps people wealthier. We know now which one of those systems keeps people fed, and it ain't communism. But please remember, a lot of these countries are breaking away from nations that market themselves as capitalist democracies, and it is completely understandable that a lot of these African nations that were breaking away from Britain and France were not on board with adopting their governmental systems. The subsequent civil wars are horrific, as so many sub-Saharan African wars are. You can see on the map that anti-communist guerrillas were armed, guess by whom, as well as the communists receiving money and weapons from Cuba, the Soviet Union, and China. These wars, like I said, they're horrific and they're obscure to us Americans. A lot of them feature alphabet soup acronyms. Mozambique has a couple. And the Mozambican Civil War is of particular note because it kills probably 1 million people, mostly due to starvation in areas where armies lived off the land. You'll notice a surprising amount of Africa became communist during this time period, or at least nominally communist, and that is one of those areas that is a blind spot for a lot of historians. I think College Board would absolutely be willing to throw out a communism in Africa question. Now, there is one other thing we got to talk about, and it was either going to be here or on our last slideshow, and our last slideshow ran a little long, so I opted to put it here. A lot of countries, especially in Africa and Asia, saw zero reason to join either side of the Cold War. In 1961, helmed primarily by India, Yugoslavia, and Egypt, these countries tried, you can see them in blue on the map there, to form the non-aligned movement, basically saying, hey, we don't want any part of your weird little, might kill everyone on the planet contest. Now you'll notice, especially if you look on the western edge of the map, you'll notice Cuba. This movement is by no means apolitical. Ethiopia, who rather infamously had a communist government at this point in time. Yugoslavia did too, but the Ethiopian government was substantially worse for the average Ethiopian. India, but not Pakistan. These countries definitely found themselves often allied with groups or with other superpowers closer than the other. A lot of them cuddled up more to the US or cuddled up more to the Soviet Union. The movement wanted stronger international bodies, specifically the United Nations, but also the IMF, the World Bank. But they also were not big fans of international intervention. When India and Pakistan began fighting over Kashmir, one of the many, many times they have done that, these bodies were saying, hey, let's intervene. And India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, pretty much said, no, bad, stay out. I want to fight Pakistan. You don't need to talk to me. But the movement does, on the overall, have at least the flavor of a third option, making it so not every country on the planet had to pick whether or not they were going to follow the Soviet Union or the US. Yugoslavia especially was a bit of a wild card through the Cold War years under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito. Really fascinating study. Wish we got to talk about him more. All right, that is all I got. Came in under 15 minutes, which, whew. Enjoy your spring break, such as it is. We will come back and talk a little bit more about communism, as well as decolonization and the decline and fall of communism when you get back from your break. See you later. Bye.